Hello everyone. If you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
The old key. Have you ever held something so small that everyone else ignored it, yet somehow it felt heavier than your entire future? A few weeks ago, I stood alone in my father's quiet house in the United States, turning a tiny brass key over in my hand. It had no label, no note, no explanation. My father had simply smiled the last time we talked about it and said, "One day, you'll know what this opens." I thought he meant an old door. I was wrong. That little key was about to unlock a secret that would change my marriage, my family, and even the way I believed in myself. If you've ever felt lost, stuck, or wondered whether one ordinary moment could quietly change your whole life, stay with me. This story begins with a key, but it certainly does not end there. My name is Emma, and I live with my husband and our 2 children in a peaceful suburb outside Minneapolis, Minnesota. From the outside, my life looked exactly like the American dream. Every morning began with coffee, school lunches, busy traffic, grocery shopping, and endless family schedules. My neighbors smiled when we walked past each other. Our children played together in the park. On weekends, we grilled hamburgers in the backyard or watched baseball on television. Everything appeared calm and predictable. But inside me, something always felt unfinished. I often practiced English while doing simple things around the house. When I folded laundry, I quietly repeated new expressions I had heard in conversations or podcasts. Sometimes I spoke to myself in front of the bathroom mirror, laughing whenever I mispronounced a difficult word. My husband would hear me and tease me with a smile. "You're practicing again?" I always answered. "You're getting better every week." Those small conversations reminded me that learning never really stops. Even after years of living here, every new phrase felt like opening another little window into people's hearts. Then everything changed on a cold Friday afternoon. The phone rang while I was preparing dinner. My father's lawyer asked if I could stop by my dad's house because there was something he had specifically asked me to receive. My father had passed away only days earlier, and I still wasn't ready to walk through his front door without hearing his familiar voice say, "Come in." The house smelled exactly the way I remembered. Old books, fresh coffee, cedar wood. Time itself seemed frozen inside those walls. The lawyer handed me a small envelope. "Your father wanted only you to have this." I expected photographs. Maybe a handwritten letter. Instead, something metallic slipped gently into my hand. A tiny brass key. Nothing else. No address. No explanation. Just a single sentence written on a folded piece of paper. "Don't look for what is valuable. Look for what is true." I read the sentence again. And again. My father had always loved puzzles. As a little girl, I used to spend rainy Saturdays solving treasure hunts he created around the house. Every clue led to another clue. Sometimes the prize was only a chocolate bar. Sometimes it was a family photo hidden inside an old book. He used to tell me that people who rushed toward answers often missed the real treasure along the way. Standing there in his living room, I suddenly remembered something I hadn't thought about in years. When I was 12, I had asked him about the brass key hanging from his workshop wall. "What does it open?" He smiled without answering. "One day, Emma." Only those 3 words. One day. Back then I thought he had forgotten. Now I realized he had been waiting. That evening I drove home with the key resting in the cup holder beside me. Every red traffic light felt longer than usual. Every question inside my mind grew louder. My husband noticed the silence as soon as I walked through the front door. "What happened?" he asked softly. Instead of answering, I placed the tiny brass key into his hand. He turned it over once, then twice. His expression changed completely. "I've seen this key before," he whispered. I stared at him, unable to breathe. "What do you mean?" You've seen it before? He looked at me for several long seconds before saying something that made my heart pound harder than ever. I don't think your father wanted only you to find what this unlocks. A promise remembered. What would you do if your husband recognized something your own father had kept secret for decades? I barely slept that night because one impossible question kept repeating in my mind. How could the two most important men in my life be connected by the same tiny brass key without me ever knowing? Every answer seemed to create two new mysteries. By sunrise, I realized this was no longer about an old keepsake. It was about a promise my father had protected until the very end, and somehow my husband had been carrying a piece of it too. I looked across the kitchen table while the morning sunlight filled our home in Minnesota. The coffee smelled warm, but neither of us touched it. My husband kept turning the key between his fingers, almost as if he were afraid it might disappear if he let go. I was only 17, he finally said. Your dad invited me to help repair the fence behind his workshop one summer. I frowned. We had started dating years later, so I had never heard the story. He showed me this exact key. I remember because it had a tiny scratch shaped like a crescent moon. I quickly leaned closer. There it was. A faint curved mark near the top of the brass handle. I had completely missed it before. He asked me one strange question. What question? I whispered. He asked, if someone you love loses hope, would you help them find it again, even if they blamed you first? My heart skipped a beat. What did you say? I told him yes. He smiled sadly. Your father nodded and said, good. One day you'll understand why I asked. Silence settled between us. For years, I believed my father rarely spoke about emotions. He fixed broken chairs, planted tomatoes every spring, and always found practical solutions. Yet beneath that quiet personality, he had apparently been planning something much bigger than I had ever imagined. That afternoon, I returned to his house alone. Everything remained exactly where he had left it. His reading glasses rested beside an unfinished crossword puzzle. His favorite baseball cap still hung near the back door. Even the old clock in the hallway ticked with slow confidence, as though time refused to acknowledge that anything had changed. I walked into his workshop. The familiar smell of cedar would instantly brought back childhood memories. My father used to teach me simple English words while we built birdhouses together. Measure. Hammer. Patience. He always smiled before saying that last word. Patience is also something you build. At the time, I laughed because patience didn't sound like something you could hold in your hands. Now, standing in the quiet workshop, those words suddenly carried a completely different meaning. I searched every shelf, every drawer, every old toolbox. Nothing. No lock. No second clue. Only dust, carefully organized tools, and years of memories. Then I noticed something unusual. One section of the bookshelf looked slightly cleaner than the rest, as if a heavy object had recently been removed. Behind several old woodworking manuals sat a faded notebook. Inside were pages of measurements, sketches, and family reminders. Most entries looked ordinary. Buy paint. Call Emma on Tuesday. Fix porch light. But near the final pages, one sentence stopped me cold. The key is never the first answer. Beneath it was another line. Ask maple before oak. I read it several times. Maple? Oak? They sounded like trees, but my father almost never wrote random words. Every sentence had a purpose. As I drove home, I couldn't stop thinking about those names. Then something clicked. Maple wasn't only a tree. Maple Street. Just 5 miles from our neighborhood. My father used to take us there every autumn because he loved the colorful leaves. At the end of that quiet street stood a small community library where he volunteered after retiring. When I pulled into the parking lot, the librarian smiled warmly. Can I help you? I hesitated before showing her the brass key. This belonged to my father. The woman's smile slowly faded. I've been wondering when someone would bring that. Every sound inside the library seemed to disappear. You know this key? She nodded. Your father left something here. My pulse raced. She disappeared into a back room and returned carrying a small sealed wooden box. Across the lid, written in my father's unmistakable handwriting, were just 6 words. Do not open this here, Emma. I stared at the box in disbelief. If my father had planned this years ago, what else had he been hiding? The hidden cabin. Have you ever been told not to open a box, only to realize that obeying might be even harder than breaking the rule? I sat in my car outside the library, holding the small wooden box on my lap, while my father's words echoed inside my mind. Do not open this here. Emma. The strange part was not the warning itself. The strange part was that my father had always trusted me with the truth. So why did he suddenly want me to wait? And more importantly, what could be inside a simple box that was worth planning years before he was gone? I drove home without turning on the radio. The streets around Minneapolis were busy as families finished work, children rode bicycles along the sidewalks, and neighbors watered their gardens. Life continued exactly as it always had, yet mine felt completely different. The wooden box rested on the passenger seat beside me like a silent passenger carrying answers I wasn't ready to hear. When I arrived home, my husband noticed it immediately. Is that what the librarian gave you? I nodded. But Dad wrote that I shouldn't open it there. He studied the handwriting for a long moment before quietly saying, then maybe he wanted all of us together. That sentence surprised me. For the first time since receiving the brass key, I realized my father might never have intended this journey to belong only to me. He had always believed that families solved life's biggest questions together, even when they disagreed along the way. That evening, after our children had finished their homework, we gathered around the dining room table. The box sat in the center under the warm kitchen light. My daughter looked at it with wide eyes. Is it treasure? I smiled. I honestly don't know. My son laughed. Grandpa always liked mysteries. He wasn't wrong. My father had turned ordinary weekends into little adventures. Sometimes he hid handwritten clues around the backyard. Sometimes he challenged us to learn a new English word before revealing the next hint. He used to say, words open minds before keys open doors. Without realizing it, those playful games had quietly built my confidence. Even today, whenever I learned a new English expression, I remembered his favorite advice. Don't memorize. Use it. So before opening the box, I taught my children one simple phrase my father loved. Stay curious. We repeated it together. Slowly. Clearly. Once. Then again. Learning English had never felt like homework in our family. It felt like sharing moments. Finally, I lifted the lid. Inside was no gold, no jewelry, and no money. Only 3 carefully wrapped items. The first was an old black and white photograph. It showed my father standing beside a small wooden cabin surrounded by tall pine trees. I had never seen the place before. The second item was a folded road map of northern Minnesota. A red circle marked one location deep inside a national forest. The third item made my heart race. Another envelope. Inside was a single handwritten message. The cabin remembers what people forget. Nothing else. No address. No explanation. Just another puzzle. I stared at the photograph again. Behind my father stood a porch with a carved wooden sign. Most of the letters had faded, but one word remained clear enough to read. Whispering Pines. My husband leaned closer. I've heard of that place. You have. My grandfather used to fish somewhere near there. Suddenly everything connected faster than I could process. The key. The library. The box. Now a hidden cabin. This wasn't a random collection of clues. My father had created a trail. The following Saturday, we packed the car before sunrise. The children thought we were simply taking a family road trip. Rolling green fields slowly gave way to endless forests, sparkling lakes, and quiet highways stretching beneath a bright blue American sky. We stopped at a small roadside diner for breakfast where the waitress greeted everyone with a cheerful, "Good morning, folks." My daughter smiled and answered confidently, "Good morning." Moments like that reminded me how language grows naturally through real life instead of perfect grammar. As we continued north, my phone suddenly lost its signal. The GPS screen froze. Miles passed without another gas station. Without another house. Without another car. Only towering pine trees surrounded us. Then, almost hidden behind thick branches, I noticed an old wooden sign leaning beside a narrow gravel road. The faded letters matched the photograph perfectly. Whispering Pines. A chill ran through my entire body. I slowly turned the steering wheel. The gravel road seemed untouched for years. After several minutes, the trees opened just enough for us to see it. The cabin. Exactly as it appeared in my father's photograph. Quiet. Weathered. Waiting. But as I reached for the car door, my husband suddenly grabbed my arm. "Emma." His voice was barely above a whisper. "Someone's already here." I looked toward the front porch. The cabin door was slowly swinging open. And whoever had entered only moments before clearly wasn't waiting for us. Love under pressure. Sometimes the scariest part of a mystery isn't opening the door. It's realizing someone else opened it first. I froze beside the car, staring at the old cabin while the front door moved gently in the breeze. My heart told me to run inside. My mind warned me to stay back. My father had spent years leaving clues only for me to follow, yet somehow another person had reached the final destination before my family. Whoever stood inside already knew something I didn't, and deep down, I feared that what waited beyond that doorway could change everything I believed about my father, my marriage, and even myself. The forest was strangely quiet. Only the wind whispered through the pine trees, carrying the fresh scent of wood and lake water across the clearing. My children stayed close to my husband, sensing that this was no longer an ordinary weekend trip. "Stay behind me," my husband said softly. I nodded, although every instinct urged me to step forward. As we walked toward the porch, the old wooden boards creaked beneath our feet. The cabin looked untouched by time. A rocking chair sat beside the entrance. Wind chimes made from old silver spoons gently tapped together. Someone had swept the porch recently. This place wasn't abandoned. Then a calm voice came from inside. "I've been expecting you." An elderly woman slowly stepped into the doorway. She looked to be in her 70s, wearing a denim jacket and hiking boots. Her silver hair was tied back neatly, and her eyes held the peaceful confidence of someone carrying a story much older than mine. "You must be Emma." I stopped walking. "How do you know my name?" She smiled kindly. "Because your father asked me to wait." For several seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, she introduced herself. "My name is Margaret. Your father and I volunteered together at the community library for nearly 15 years. The pieces began connecting once again. "The library," I whispered. She nodded. "Yes, the box was only meant to bring you here." Inside the cabin, everything felt warm despite the cool autumn air outside. A fireplace crackled quietly. Handmade quilts covered an old sofa. Family photographs decorated the walls, but none of the faces were familiar. Margaret invited us to sit down. Before saying another word, she poured hot apple cider into simple ceramic mugs. My father never told me about this place, I admitted. He wanted you to discover it when you were ready. When was I supposed to be ready? Margaret looked directly into my eyes. When you stopped looking for answers and started looking for meaning. Those words sounded exactly like something my father would say. While the children explored the shelves filled with old books and board games, my husband quietly examined a carved wooden table. I've seen this carving before, he said. Across the edge were 3 carefully carved words. Choose love first. Margaret smiled. Your father carved that himself. I felt tears beginning to form. Growing up, my father rarely gave long speeches. Instead, he believed small daily actions mattered more than beautiful promises. He believed helping a neighbor, apologizing first, sharing dinner together, or listening carefully were all ways of saying I love you without speaking those exact words. Margaret stood and walked toward an old bookshelf. She removed a weathered dictionary. At first, I almost laughed. A dictionary? Then she opened it. The pages had been carefully cut into a hidden compartment. Inside rested another folded letter. My name appeared across the front. Emma. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. If you're reading this, you've already learned that love is patient enough to wait. But patience alone cannot protect a family. Trust must grow every single day. I swallowed hard. The letter continued. There will come a moment when you question someone you love most. Before you decide they're hiding the truth, remember that sometimes people protect a surprise, not a secret. I looked up. Without realizing it, I turned toward my husband. Over the past year, stress had quietly changed us. Between work, raising 2 children, paying bills, and managing everyday responsibilities, we sometimes misunderstood each other over the smallest things. Quick conversations replaced long ones. Tired evenings replaced shared dreams. The letter felt as though my father had somehow seen our future. My husband gently reached for my hand. I know we've both been carrying too much lately. I squeezed his fingers. So have I. Margaret smiled without interrupting. Then she walked to the window. There is one last place your father wanted you to see. She pointed toward the forest behind the cabin. A narrow walking trail disappeared between towering pine trees. About 10 minutes from here, she said quietly, there's something he built himself. What is it? I asked. She hesitated. He told me not to explain. Instead, she reached into her pocket and handed me a small iron key. Unlike the brass key, this one was darker, heavier, and much older. It won't fit the box, she whispered. It opens something else. As we stepped outside, the afternoon sun began disappearing behind the trees. Long shadows stretched across the path ahead. Halfway down the trail, my daughter suddenly stopped walking. She pointed silently into the woods. There, between the trees, stood a man wearing my father's old brown jacket, watching us. Then, without saying a single word, he turned and disappeared deeper into the forest. The locked chest. Have you ever chased someone through the woods, only to discover that what you were really chasing was a memory? The man wearing my father's old brown jacket vanished into the forest so quickly that I questioned whether I had truly seen him. My children stood frozen behind me. My husband called my name, asking me not to run ahead. But my heart had already made the decision. If that stranger knew anything about my father, I had to find him. I had followed clues for days, yet something told me the greatest secret was still waiting just beyond the next bend in the trail. I hurried along the narrow path beneath the towering pines, my footsteps crunching across dry leaves. The cool Minnesota air filled my lungs, carrying the earthy scent of moss and cedar. Every few seconds, I caught another glimpse of the brown jacket between the trees, only for it to disappear again. It felt less like following a person and more like following a fading piece of my childhood. "Emma," my husband called from behind. "Slow down." I finally stopped near a small clearing where sunlight filtered through the branches above. The stranger was gone. Only silence remained. Then I noticed something unusual. In the middle of the clearing stood an old wooden bench. Carved into its back were words I knew immediately belonged to my father. "Some things are found only when you stop chasing them." I smiled despite the confusion. That sentence sounded exactly like him. As children, whenever my brother and I lost our favorite toys, Dad never searched for us. Instead, he calmly said, "Take a breath. Look carefully. Your eyes work better than your panic." He wasn't teaching us how to find objects. He was teaching us how to face life. My daughter sat beside me on the bench. "Mom," she whispered, "Grandpa always liked making people think." He really did. She looked around the clearing before quietly practicing one of the English phrases we had repeated together many times. "Look carefully." I smiled. Exactly. Learning English had become something beautiful in moments like these. Instead of memorizing vocabulary from a textbook, my children connected words to real experiences. They remembered expressions because they carried emotions, not because they appeared on a test. Just as I stood to continue walking, my husband pointed toward a cluster of large rocks at the edge of the clearing. There, hidden beneath fallen branches, stood a weathered wooden chest. My heart began pounding. It wasn't large. It wasn't decorated. But one detail caught my attention immediately. The lock. It matched the old iron key Margaret had given me. For several seconds, nobody moved. The forest seemed to hold its breath with us. Slowly, I reached into my jacket pocket. The heavy iron key felt colder than before. My hands trembled as I slid it into the lock. Click. The sound echoed far louder than it should have. I lifted the lid. Inside was no fortune. No stacks of cash. No hidden family treasure. Instead, the chest contained dozens of carefully organized envelopes tied together with blue ribbon. Each envelope carried a handwritten label. For Emma. For her husband. For my grandchildren. For a difficult day. For the day you feel like giving up. Tears blurred my vision. My father hadn't hidden wealth. He had hidden encouragement. On top of the letters rested a small leather journal. I opened the first page. If this chest has been opened, then my greatest hope has already come true. You chose curiosity over fear. I couldn't hold back my tears anymore. Every page revealed stories I had never heard before. My father wrote about mistakes he regretted, moments he wished he had hugged me longer, and ordinary family dinners that had become his happiest memories. One paragraph caught my attention immediately. Real strength is not pretending everything is fine. Real strength is allowing the people who love you to walk beside you. I quietly looked at my husband. Without saying anything, he wrapped his arm around my shoulder. For months, we had both tried to solve every problem alone. My father had somehow written exactly what we needed to hear. Then something slipped from between the journal pages. A folded photograph. It showed my father standing beside the same man wearing the brown jacket. On the back, written in faded ink, were 5 words. He knows the final truth. Before I could say anything, a dry branch snapped somewhere behind us. We turned at the same time. The man from the forest was standing only a few yards away. This time he wasn't running. He looked directly at me, took a slow breath, and quietly said the one sentence I never expected to hear. "Emma, your father asked me not to tell you everything until today." Lessons across generations. What if the person holding your family's biggest secret wasn't a stranger at all, but someone your father trusted more than anyone else? I couldn't move. The man in my father's brown jacket stood only a few steps away, calm and patient, as though he had been waiting for this exact moment for years. Every question that had filled my mind since receiving the brass key suddenly collided at once. Who is he? Why had my father chosen him? And why did it feel as if my father was still quietly guiding every step I took, even though he was no longer here? The man slowly removed his baseball cap before speaking again. My name is Daniel. His voice was gentle, carrying the relaxed confidence of someone who spent more time listening than talking. I met your father almost 20 years ago. I searched his face for any trace of recognition, but I was certain we had never met. You work together? I asked. He smiled. No. We became friends because of a broken fishing boat. I blinked. A fishing boat? He laughed softly. Your father believed every good friendship started with helping someone. The story sounded exactly like Dad. Daniel explained that years earlier, his boat had broken down on a nearby lake. My father happened to be fishing that morning. Instead of simply offering tools, he stayed for hours until everything was repaired. They shared sandwiches, coffee from a metal thermos, and conversations that continued for decades. He never judged people by their jobs, Daniel said. He judged them by how they treated others when nobody was watching. Those words settled quietly inside me. That was my father. Simple, steady, kind. Daniel looked toward my children, who were carefully reading the labels on the envelopes inside the wooden chest. He talked about them all the time. My daughter smiled shyly. Grandpa said stories are better than presents. Daniel nodded. He believed stories last longer. As we slowly walked back toward the cabin together, Daniel carried the old chest while my husband carried the journal. The afternoon sunlight painted long golden lines across the forest trail. For a while, nobody spoke. Then Daniel suddenly asked my son a simple question. What's one English word you learned this week? My son thought for a moment. Grateful. Daniel smiled. That's one of your grandfather's favorite words. He stopped walking and pointed toward the trees. Can you use it in a sentence? My son answered carefully. I am grateful for my family. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. So was your grandfather. I realized something beautiful in that quiet moment. Learning English wasn't separate from life. It became meaningful when it carried real emotions, real memories, and real conversations. My father had always understood that language connected hearts long before it connected grammar rules. Back inside the cabin, Daniel opened another envelope that my father had addressed simply. Read together. He handed it to me. I unfolded the pages slowly. Emma, if you're reading this with the people you love, then you've already succeeded. I paused, swallowing hard. Many people spend their whole lives searching for larger houses, better jobs, or more money. Very few realize that the richest families are simply the ones who still enjoy sitting around the same table. The room became completely silent. My husband quietly reached for my hand again. The children listened without interrupting. The letter continued. When you disagree, speak gently. When you're tired, rest before arguing. When someone apologizes, don't make them earn forgiveness twice. I smiled through tears. Those weren't complicated lessons, but they were the kind people often forgot during busy lives. Daniel looked toward the fireplace. Your father rewrote that letter 6 different times. He did. He wanted every word to sound like a conversation, not a lecture. That made me laugh. It sounded exactly like him. He never wanted to impress people. He only wanted them to feel understood. Just before sunset, Daniel carried one final wooden box from beneath the staircase. This, he said quietly, is the only thing your father told me never to open. The box was smaller than the first one. Its surface had faded with age. There was no lock. Only a single brass plate engraved with 4 simple words. Only when ready. I looked at Daniel. What does ready mean? He slowly shook his head. I asked him the same question. And? He smiled. Of course he did. Dad always answered difficult questions with patience instead of explanations. As I gently lifted the lid, expecting another letter, I found something completely different. Inside rested a small digital voice recorder. A tiny green light suddenly flashed. Without anyone touching it, the recorder turned on by itself. Then, through the quiet cabin, I heard my father's unmistakable voice. Hello, Emma. If you can hear this, there's one truth I never told you. Sharing the secret. Have you ever heard the voice of someone you deeply loved after believing you would never hear it again? The instant my father's voice came through the tiny recorder, every sound inside the cabin disappeared. Even the crackling fireplace seemed to fall silent. My children looked at me with wide eyes. My husband squeezed my hand. I wanted to press pause because I wasn't ready for whatever came next, but I also knew this recording had waited years for this exact moment. Sometimes the hardest truth isn't the one we fear. It's the one that finally sets us free. The recorder clicked softly before my father's familiar voice filled the room. Emma, if you're smiling right now, then you still make the same face you did when you solved one of my little puzzles. I laughed through tears. Even after everything, he still knew how to make me smile. I wish I could be sitting beside you, he continued, but life doesn't always give us one more conversation. That's why I started this journey long before today. The room remained completely still. My children had never heard their grandfather's recorded voice before. My daughter quietly rested her head against my shoulder. My father continued. You probably think this story is about a key. He paused. It isn't. It's about trust. Another pause. And trust grows one small choice at a time. His words settled deeply inside me. For months, I had been searching for an object. My father had been guiding me toward a way of living. The recording continued with a warmth that felt almost like he was sitting across the table. When you wake up tomorrow, choose kindness before being right. Listen before answering. Hug your family before checking your phone. My son smiled. That sounds like Grandpa. It really does, I whispered. Dad had always believed that the strongest families weren't perfect. They simply kept choosing each other, even after difficult days. The recorder clicked again. Emma, I have one small request. I leaned closer. When your children are old enough, don't give them this key. I blinked. Instead, teach them why it mattered. I looked toward the brass key resting on the table. For the first time, I understood. The key itself wasn't the inheritance. The lessons were. My husband quietly picked up one of the envelopes addressed to him. Should I? I nodded. He unfolded the letter slowly. Within seconds, his eyes filled with tears. What does it say? I asked gently. He took a deep breath. Your father thanked me. For what? For loving you on the days when you forgot how valuable you were. I couldn't speak. Those words reached a place inside my heart I didn't even realize had been hurting. Life had become so busy that I often measured myself by unfinished chores, work deadlines, and daily responsibilities. Somewhere along the way, I had forgotten that being loved wasn't something I had to earn. Daniel quietly smiled across the room. Your father noticed things other people missed. I nodded. He always did. Before leaving the cabin, we gathered outside beneath the tall pine trees. The evening air felt cool and peaceful. My daughter suddenly asked if we could continue practicing one English phrase Grandpa loved. What was it again? She asked. I smiled. Choose love first. We all repeated it together. Slowly. Clearly. Choose love first. Simple words. Powerful meaning. I realized that language becomes unforgettable when it carries emotion. That was exactly how my father had taught me. Not through long grammar lessons, but through ordinary moments that stayed in my heart forever. Just as we prepared to drive home, Daniel handed me one final envelope. "This one," he said softly, "he asked me to give you only after you listen to the recording." Across the front were 4 handwritten words. "Open at home." The drive back felt strangely peaceful. For the first time since this journey began, I wasn't chasing clues. I was carrying them home. Late that night, after the children had fallen asleep, my husband and I sat together at our kitchen table. The house was completely quiet. I carefully opened the final envelope. Inside was a folded property document. At first, I didn't understand what I was reading. Then my eyes reached the final page. The owner's signature. My father's name. And directly beneath it, mine. The cabin had never belonged to a stranger. My father had quietly transferred it to me years before. But one sentence written at the bottom changed everything once again. The real inheritance is still hidden beneath the floor. My husband slowly looked toward me. Neither of us said a word, because we both knew exactly where we were driving at sunrise. A new beginning. What if the greatest treasure your father left behind wasn't hidden inside a chest, but buried beneath the floor of a cabin that now belonged to you? I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the final sentence from his letter. The real inheritance is still hidden beneath the floor. My imagination raced through endless possibilities. Was it money? Old family documents? Another secret? By sunrise, one thing was certain. This journey was no longer about solving my father's mystery. It was about discovering why he believed the final lesson could only be found after everything else. The drive north felt different this time. The roads through Minnesota looked just as beautiful as before, with quiet lakes reflecting the morning sunlight and endless forests stretching toward the horizon. Yet my heart was calmer. Days earlier, I had been searching for answers. Now I was learning to appreciate every step of the journey itself. When we arrived at Whispering Pines, the cabin welcomed us with the same peaceful silence. Morning light poured through the tall pine trees, and a gentle breeze carried the familiar scent of cedar wood across the porch. Daniel was already waiting. "I thought you'd come early," he said with a warm smile. "I don't think I could have waited another day," I admitted. He nodded, almost as if my father had predicted that answer too. Inside the cabin, we moved the old rug away from the center of the living room. Beneath it lay wide wooden floorboards that had clearly been crafted by hand many years earlier. Daniel pointed toward one board that looked slightly newer than the others. He replaced this himself. My husband knelt beside it and carefully lifted the board with a small pry bar. A soft cloud of dust floated into the sunlight. Hidden beneath the floor was a flat wooden case. It wasn't large. It wasn't locked. There were no jewels, no stacks of cash, and no shining treasure waiting to surprise us. Instead, inside the case rested dozens of handwritten journals. Every notebook was labeled with a different year. My father had spent nearly 20 years writing them. I slowly opened the oldest one. The first page read, "Today Emma smiled because she finally pronounced the word beautiful without stopping halfway through. She doesn't realize it yet, but confidence grows quietly." I covered my mouth. I didn't even remember that day. Yet my father had. Page after page revealed small moments I had forgotten. Family picnics, snowstorms, birthday dinners, late-night conversations around the kitchen table. None of them seemed extraordinary at the time. Together, they became the story of our family. My daughter sat beside me, carefully turning another page. "Grandpa wrote everything. He wanted us to remember," I whispered. One journal contained nothing but encouraging sentences. Short reminders. "Speak with courage. Forgive quickly. Laugh often. Keep learning. The last one made me smile. Even now, whenever I practiced English, I sometimes worried about making mistakes. My father had always believed mistakes were signs of progress. I looked at my children. Let's practice one sentence together. They smiled. We read it slowly. Keep learning every day. Again. A little more confidently. Keep learning every day. Those simple words felt different now. Language wasn't only something to study. It was something that connected generations. My husband quietly flipped through another journal. Suddenly, an old folded newspaper clipping slipped onto the floor. Across the front page was a photograph of my father standing beside the Whispering Pines cabin during a community charity event years earlier. The headline read, "Local carpenter donates cabin for family learning retreat." I frowned. Donates? Daniel nodded. Your father let struggling families stay here for free. What? He never wanted anyone to know. I stared at the photograph in disbelief. All those years, he had quietly helped dozens of families rebuild their lives without asking for recognition. The cabin had never been a place to hide treasure. It had always been a place to create hope. That realization changed something inside me. For the first time in months, I no longer felt overwhelmed by work, responsibilities, or daily routines. I felt grateful. Deeply grateful. As the afternoon sunlight filled the cabin, I noticed one final notebook resting alone beneath all the others. Unlike the rest, it had no year written on the cover. Only one sentence. For Emma's tomorrow. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside wasn't another memory. It wasn't another lesson. It was a handwritten map. The map pointed beyond the cabin, toward a quiet hill overlooking a small lake. Across the bottom, my father's final instruction was written in careful blue ink. Go there before sunset. Bring your family. You'll finally understand why I left you the key. I slowly looked out the cabin window toward the distant trees. The sun had already begun its slow descent. Whatever waited on that hill. It was the final piece of my father's extraordinary plan. Unlocking my future. What if the final destination on your father's map wasn't meant to reveal another secret, but to reveal the person you were becoming? As we left the cabin with the handwritten map safely tucked inside my jacket, I realized something unexpected. I was no longer asking what my father had hidden. Instead, I found myself asking why he wanted me to experience every clue before reaching the end. Whatever waited on that quiet hill beside the lake, it wasn't simply another surprise. It was the final chapter of a story he had carefully written with love, patience, and hope long before I ever knew I would need it. The trail to the hill was narrow but peaceful. Golden sunlight slipped through the tall pine trees, painting warm patterns across the ground. Birds sang somewhere above us, and the cool breeze carried the fresh scent of the nearby lake. My children walked ahead, laughing as they searched for unusual-shaped rocks and colorful leaves. Watching them reminded me of my own childhood. My father never rushed family walks. He believed the best conversations happened when nobody was in a hurry. Sometimes he would suddenly stop and ask me one simple question. What beautiful thing did you almost miss today? Back then, I usually answered with something obvious. A butterfly. A rainbow. A squirrel climbing a tree. Now I understood what he had really been teaching me. Gratitude begins with paying attention. About 20 minutes later, the trees opened into a quiet hill overlooking a sparkling lake. The view took my breath away. The water reflected the evening sky like polished glass, while the last rays of sunlight painted everything in soft shades of gold and orange. Near the center of the hill stood a single wooden bench. It looked familiar. As I stepped closer, I saw my father's name carved neatly into one corner. Beneath it were 6 simple words. Sit together before you decide." I smiled through tears. Even here, my father was still offering advice. We all sat down. Nobody spoke. For several peaceful minutes, we simply listened to the wind moving gently through the trees. Then my daughter quietly broke the silence. "Mom." "Yes." "I think Grandpa wanted us to slow down." I looked at her and smiled. "I think you're right." Beside the bench stood a small wooden post with a weatherproof metal box attached to it. Inside rested one final envelope. No dramatic warning. No puzzle. Only my name. I carefully opened it. The handwriting was instantly familiar. "Emma, if you've reached this place, then you've already unlocked everything I hoped you would." I paused, taking a slow breath. "The brass key opened your curiosity. The iron key opened your memories. But neither of them could unlock your future." I continued reading. "Only forgiveness, gratitude, and love can do that." My eyes filled with tears once again. For so long, I had believed this journey was leading towards something hidden beneath the ground. Instead, it had been leading towards something hidden inside me. I looked at my husband. We had survived difficult seasons together. Busy schedules. Financial pressure. Misunderstandings. Long days when we forgot to truly listen. Yet somehow, this journey had gently brought us back to each other. He smiled. "What are you thinking?" I laughed softly. "I'm thinking Dad planned all of this better than either of us plans family vacations." Everyone laughed. Even Daniel. The tension that had followed us since the first mysterious key finally disappeared. Before leaving, my son asked if we could practice one last English sentence together. I nodded. We looked across the lake and repeated slowly. "The future begins today." Again. A little louder. "The future begins today." Those words felt powerful because they weren't only English practice anymore. They had become a promise. As the sun finally slipped below the horizon, something unexpected caught my attention. Beneath the bench, hidden almost completely by fallen leaves, was a small bronze plaque I hadn't noticed before. I knelt down and brushed away the dirt. The plaque contained only one sentence. "If you're reading this, go home before opening the final letter." I looked at Daniel in surprise. "I thought that was the last one." He smiled gently. So did I. My heart began racing again. "There is another letter." Daniel reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Without saying a word, he carefully placed one sealed envelope into my hands. Its paper looked newer than all the others. Across the front, in my father's unmistakable handwriting, were the words that instantly brought tears back to my eyes. "Open this only after you walk through your own front door." I stared at the envelope all the way home, wondering how one final letter could possibly change everything one last time. The greatest inheritance. What if the final letter your father ever wrote wasn't meant to end the story, but to begin yours? The sealed envelope rested in my hands all the way home, and somehow it felt heavier than the brass key that had started this incredible journey. I could have opened it in the car. I could have opened it before stepping inside. But for the first time, I understood why my father had always asked me to wait. Some truths only make sense when you're standing exactly where life wants you to be. As I unlocked my own front door, I realized the greatest mystery had never been hidden in a cabin, a chest, or a forgotten map. It had been waiting quietly inside the place I called home. The house felt unusually peaceful that evening. The familiar scent of cinnamon candles drifted through the living room. Family photos covered the hallway walls. My children's backpacks rested beside the staircase exactly where they always left them. Nothing had changed. Yet somehow, everything had changed. My husband gently closed the front door behind us. "We're home," he whispered. I looked down at the envelope. Across the front, my father's handwriting seemed almost alive. Open this only after you walk through your own front door. I slowly broke the seal. Inside rested only one handwritten letter. No keys. No maps. No riddles. Just my father's final message. Dear Emma, if you're reading this at home, then you've already discovered what I hoped you would. The key was never the treasure. The cabin was never the destination. The letters were never the reward. I stopped reading for a moment. Tears blurred every word. My father continued. I wanted you to see that the happiest life is built one ordinary day at a time. A family dinner. A conversation without distractions. A child laughing in the next room. A husband who still reaches for your hand. These are the things people spend their lives chasing after they ignore them. I looked toward my husband. Without saying a word, he smiled exactly the way he had on our wedding day. My father had somehow managed to bring us closer together even after he was gone. The letter continued. You once asked me what the brass key opened. Today you know the answer. It opened your eyes. I quietly laughed through my tears. Only my father could spend years creating a mystery simply to teach one unforgettable lesson. Near the end of the letter, one paragraph stood apart from all the others. Promise me one thing. Keep telling stories. Read together. Learn together. Never let your home become too busy for kindness. Those simple sentences became more valuable than anything money could ever buy. My daughter climbed onto the sofa beside me. Mom? Yes? Can we come back to Grandpa's cabin? I smiled. I think he'd love that. My son added another question. Can we invite other families too? I looked toward my husband. He nodded before I even spoke. That was it. The real purpose of Whispering Pines had never ended. We decided that evening to continue my father's quiet tradition. A few weekends every year, we would open the cabin to families who needed rest, encouragement, or simply time together. We would fill the bookshelves with children's stories, board games, and simple English reading books so parents and children could learn side by side. It felt like the perfect way to honor the man who had taught me that language becomes meaningful when it brings hearts closer together. Before bedtime, we stood together in the kitchen. One final time, we practiced an English sentence my father would have loved. Slowly, clearly, together. Home is where love grows. We repeated it again. Not because we needed better pronunciation. Because we wanted to remember its meaning. Outside, the first stars appeared above the quiet Minnesota sky. For the first time in many months, my heart felt completely at peace. I finally understood why my father never rushed me toward the answers. He wasn't teaching me how to solve a mystery. He was teaching me how to live. The small brass key now rests inside a simple wooden frame on the bookshelf in our living room. Visitors sometimes ask what it opens. I always smile before answering. It opened my future. And every time I tell this story, I remember something my father once whispered while handing me that tiny key years ago. The greatest inheritance is never something you keep. It's something you pass on. Thank you for listening to my story. If it reminded you of someone you love or inspired you to keep learning English one small step at a time, I hope you'll carry that lesson with you today. Sometimes one new word, one honest conversation, or one small act of kindness can unlock a future you never imagined. That's all for today. I'll make many more stories like this in the future. Please subscribe so you don't miss the next one.